Hello, Friday, November 4th, we had our third meeting this fall semester talking about engaged teaching, and the topic for this meeting was planning, attending to virtual elements. So if you weren't able to make the meeting or you'd like to see the information again, here's a quick walkthrough video of what we talked about. So we began by talking about our agenda for the hour, and focusing in on those engaged teaching elements that we've been talking about, knowing what, knowing how, and knowing why. We finished our foundations piece, and we're in the third meeting in the planning portion of engaged teaching. So we talked, our what for this meeting was talking about visual design. Our why was research on visual design for instruction. How, tips for visual design for instruction, and then we ended off the meeting with some resources that we could explore on our own, and we built a Google Sheet with some resources. So here we are on our map of the engaged teaching model. We've talked about foundations in August, and we've been discussing planning and 3 meetings in this planning circle of the engaged teaching model. So we have identified learning goals, objectives, and outcomes. We talked about assessing and grading student outcomes. And today we're talking about visual elements in teaching. So I wanted to revisit the 2 educational researchers that are building the foundation for engaged teaching, this engaged teaching model that we've been talking about. Elizabeth Barkley, who's a professor of music at Foothill College in California, and Claire Major, who's a professor in educational leadership and policy and technical studies at the University of Alabama. And I picked a couple of quotes, recent quotes of theirs around engaged teaching and the engaged teaching model. They say the challenge is to find ways to present good information in a manner that engages students in the content. And another that we talked about was well-designed materials support student learning because they provide clarity, promote positive associations to the material in their own lives, and emphasize the relevance of course materials. And I shared a link to a blog post that was reflections on a presentation that they did in 2018, the AAC&U webinar, which is a really neat blog post to check out. So the link is here, and it'll also be in the PDF that I share. So we dove right into the topic that we called knowing what about visual elements. And one way to think about visual design in your teaching is talking about typeface and font. So we talked about serif fonts, which is little feet, and sans serif without little feet. And we talked about how sans serif fonts like Open Sans, which is the font in this PowerPoint template that was created by our Chatt State marketing team, are sans serif or without feet. And it is a font that is very visually appealing and easy to read in PowerPoints and presentations and posters. When you have larger sections of text, like part of an essay or a writing prompt, that is a good time to think about serif fonts or little feet, things we might think of as Times New Roman or Cambria. And then we talked about condensed fonts. And again, condensed fonts, a good example is Open Sans, which is what this PowerPoint is. And non-condensed font would be something like Arial. And the way that I tell the difference between a condensed font and a not condensed font for me, font is I look at the O, and the O is a very round shape, like a circle. That is not condensed. And a condensed font like Open Sans, like in this marketing template given to us by our marketing team, you see that the O is very oval shaped. Condensed fonts are great fonts to use for graphics because it helps communicate the information tightly and focuses the brain on what's visual. So then in our meeting, we looked at these 2 examples of graphics. It's the same information, but presented two different ways. And we talked about what we liked and what we didn't like about these two graphics. And you could see that graphics A is a condensed, they are both sans serif. Neither one of them have little feet. B is Arial, Calibri, and A is Open Sans. And you can see that both of them have a legend, but graphic B has the brain doing a couple of different things to take in the information. It has to look at where the graph bar ends and then draw its eyes down to the bottom to see what the percentage is and then make sense of the legend, where graphic A has less tasks for our brain to do to take in the information. It is a more brain compatible graphic, if you will, because the percentages are right on the bar. And by looking at it, you can tell that no one strongly disagreed to the information. One thing that the group really liked about graphic B was the contrast in color. So in doing this again, it might be important to think about how can we adjust the colors, in particular, maybe adjust them to our Chatt state colors if this were Chatt state data, which it's not, and then think about contrasting colors and narrowing the task that the brain has to do to understand the graphic. So then we talked about photos as another type of visual design and how where we can find photos and how we can adjust them so that they are more engaging. So content presented as graphics and photos are more engaging to students, particularly in a presentation. Instead of a PowerPoint with lots of text on it, a photo, you've heard the expression, a picture's worth 1,000 words. That goes for our teaching. So I shared a couple of places that you might want to go for graphics that are free to use. One is Unsplash, and we shared the link. Another is Pixels, which is part of the Creative Commons, and there's a link to Pixels. And then another is Edu Images by All Ed, and this one has photographs from real school settings that are free to use. And I share that this one was my favorite most of the time. It's my first place that I check, but it has a limited number of photos compared to Pixels and Unsplash, which have much more. And then we talked about graphics and how condensed sans serif fonts are best for graphics. They're more brain compatible and they give you, frankly, more space on the page for your visual instead of the text. And we have great tools in our Microsoft suite that we can use to help us make graphics. So the top one is from Excel and the bottom one is the same graphic features available in PowerPoint. And there are things that we can do, adjustments that we can make by removing the lines in the back of a graphic and giving it more white space and adding the data labels to the graphic itself instead of keeping it on the bottom of the X and bottom of the X-axis, where it can be difficult for the brain to do multiple steps. And then I shared a source from Duarte called Diagrammer, and it's a really cool website where you can freely download different types of graphics. You can take a look at the menu bar and filter by what you would like to have a graphic for and filter by style. I have it set here to 2D. We always want to use 2D for graphics. 3D graphics are very hard for the brain to take in information because it has to think about the thickness of the slice or piece compared to the shape, and also oftentimes make sense of the legend. So 2D graphics are more brain compatible than 3D graphics. And then we looked at another example as a group. So both A and B visualize the same information. And we talked about what are some ways that we might think about this in our classroom. And we had a great discussion about how not knowing the pieces and the areas on the graph, if you didn't know those locations, you would, in graphic A, you'd be working with the legend and then having to put those data labels where they belong on the map, where in B, the legend is integrated into the graphic and it tells you where those locations are. And in this case, this is research with butterflies. So it's telling you which butterflies were captured in the different locations. The group also really liked the contrast with picture B and the brightness of the blue and how it makes things pop out. And I shared that this graphic was made with Bing Maps, and the addition of the contrast was just done with additional curved shapes to add the contrast to the graph. Okay, then we talked about interactive simulations and imagery and how when students are able to interact with images, it leads to even more engagement. And we shared a couple. One was the Biointeractive by Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and we shared the link there. This is primarily for science and mathematics. It has some great simulations that students can run thinking about, if you're thinking about exponential growth and math. This has some great examples in there tied to biology. And then we shared my favorite OER platform called Oasis, but it does have a box on the menu bar specifically for simulations. So we talked about that and all OER materials, but if you're looking for interactive simulations, this is a great place to go. And then we talked about Merlot, which is a very large OER platform that also has a filter capability if you're looking for interactive. And then we shared some of our other favorites that we have used in our teaching. Then we ended off with the knowing why piece and just some research on visual design for instruction. And I shared 3 researchers that I gravitate to when I think about visual design. One is Stephanie Evergreen from Evergreen Data, and I shared there's a link to her blog there. What I love about her work is it's grounded in brain research and how the brain learns best, how the brain takes in information. Similarly is Ann K. Emery, whose research is along those lines as well. What I love about Ann K. Emery's work is that she has a very adaptable graphics, just like Stephanie Evergreen, but for an assessment and evaluation piece. So I find her graphics very approachable, and I also put a link to her website there, and her blog is embedded, and she has lots of great tips. And then I put Chris Lissy, who has a great new book out, Reporting Revolution, and he talks about how to make visualizations in different platforms, one of which that he's been doing a lot of posting about is using Canva, which I've noticed many of the faculty at Chatt State use. So I thought he was an interesting one to put on there. And then I also shared the way in which he talks about assessment and reporting in this graphic. So he always does a Halloween cartoon. So the one on the left was a coloring of a graphic he had about a scary costume project. And what I want to point to is that I'm a 3D pie chart. I'm the scariest kind of chart because of that, what the brain has to do to take in 3-dimensional charts. And then the one on the right is an older one where it's about zombies and brains, and the educator is saying, I know you want to eat brains, but what are your intended outcomes here? So I thought that was funny, helped us think about our intended outcomes in our teaching. And the last thing we talked about was this great website for universal design for learning. And of course, we were only meeting for an hour, so we didn't have time to delve deeply into universal design for learning. But I really enjoy the CAST site. And the link to the CAST site is at the bottom under the chart. And I pulled this from the website. And all of their thinking around universal design for learning is based in brain research and how the brain learns best. And I love this graphic because it goes right along with the engaged teaching model. The part of our brain that helps us think about strategy and networks is our how part in our frontal cortex. Affective networks, the why we do things, the emotional part of the brain, and then the recognition network. What is it that we need to pay attention to? What is novel here? What connections can I make to previous learning when I take in this new information? And then I I shared this quote from their website that explains what CAST is. So CAST is a multifaceted organization with a singular ambition: bust the barriers to learning that millions of people experience every day. We do this by helping educators and organizations apply insights from learning and sciences and leading edge practices to educational design and implementation. And after we finished talking about this, we went into breakout rooms and we added information to a Google Sheet where all of these links are in the Google Sheet. And then we had the opportunity to go and explore and even add more to the Google Sheet. So if you're interested in the link to that, please give me an email and I will be happy to share that with you. And I hope you can join us next week for our Engaged Teaching time together where we'll talk about climate. Thank you very much.